community, as individuals, what have you. And so, when you think about that, what that's going to take, and I put this slide together, I thought about, a few things. I'm sure if we opened it up to discussion, we could come up with others, but, it's certainly access to care, right? You need access. Socioeconomics come in. I think it's things like healthy relationships, all kinds of things. Even a little bit of luck is not such a bad thing. I was thinking, gosh, just about a year and a half ago, I was golfing. Occasionally I golf. And I was in the golf cart, and I was going to get out. We had pulled up to where one of the holes was, and so I was going to get out to go putt, right? And I go to get up, and I kind of catch a little bit of a blur, and then I literally feel something like touch my hair, and then a golf ball smashes into the back of the golf cart. And I was like almost paralyzed for a moment. I couldn't believe it. But the guy I was playing with, I thought, went berserk. And then you look over, and about 150 yards away, someone had just hit into us. And I don't know what the guy was doing. Maybe he didn't see the golf cart over there or whatever. And I think about that periodically. Not sure what that would have done to me. It would not have been pretty. And I literally felt it touch my hair. So as I thought about that, I put luck in on this slide, because I don't know if that would have been awareness. I don't know what that would have been. That, to me, was a little bit of luck right there. So, but the ones I'm going to focus on today are exercise, stress management, awareness, including this concept of mindfulness that many of you are probably familiar with, nutrition, and then finally just a little bit on complementary medicine. Often what people expect me to talk most about, very little on that. Why am I going to focus on those? Well, for one thing, when you look at what is driving the cost of healthcare nowadays that we talk about a lot, and the projected cost of healthcare, the vast majority of it, the vast majority of the expenditures, and the vast majority of deaths in this country are caused by conditions, chronic conditions, that are largely preventable or in many ways treatable through behavior modification, right? So we're talking about diabetes, certainly type 2, we're talking about obesity, heart disease, certain cancers. And when you think about the things I just highlighted, if we said, well, what do we need to do besides write for the right pills or do the right surgeries? It's about eating better, it's about exercising, it's about managing stress. These are the kind of things that we really need to do to curb the cost of healthcare, but also hopefully impact on what is really driving a lot of what people end up dying from, and of course often die after years of morbidity with these conditions. So let's start with exercise. And again, this is a little bit, I have to be honest, about maybe guiding some conversations we might be able to have with our patients, but also maybe the internal conversations we have with ourselves and the things that we all need to be doing to be caring for the caretaker. I think, exercise is interesting. I think one of the challenges is that we often kind of go by some sort of, oh, by the way, this says, what fits your busy schedule better, exercising 1 hour a day or being dead 24 hours a day, if you couldn't read it in the back. So exercise is one of those things you cannot do without. We often don't personalize it well enough, and that can be challenging. So we'll say things like, 30 minutes on most days and 150 minutes, and there's some reasons for that. When you look at, for example, this is a very recent study, just came out in the last couple of months, that looked at the economic impact of exercising in people with cardiovascular disease and without. And if you had cardiovascular disease and you exercised at least 30 minutes 5 times a day, so there's 150 minutes, there was a savings of about $2,500 per year. And if you didn't have heart disease and you exercised for that amount of time as a minimum, there was a savings of about $500 per year in healthcare expenditures. And so again, if you start to multiply that times, 100 million, 150 million, whatever, 200 million, you begin to see some numbers that are meaningful in terms of some of the savings, potential savings for the healthcare system. The potential benefits of exercise, and this obviously isn't a whole lecture on exercise, are really innumerable. And certainly for me, we're going to talk a little more about meditation, mindfulness in a minute. I will admit, I'm not a regular meditator. I will admit that even with Larry in the room. But, all right, good. Well, we're coming clean. But we all need tools on our tool belt to manage stress, right? And so, for me, I am someone who likes to exercise. So I start out my day typically at the gym. Some mornings, like this morning, I actually had an 8 o'clock patient before coming over here. You know, it was a quick workout. I only got about 25 minutes in, 20 minutes in. Other times I can take a little bit longer. But I try to do it fairly regularly because I feel better not only physically, but sort of keeps my mind in the game as well. The social aspects, all kinds of different reasons why one should exercise. But what do we do? What do we tell our patients? You know, maybe 150 minutes per week, you know, something like that. I think when you really dig down into the literature, you can do less if you're more intense. You know, the intensity makes a difference. What I think is most important is that people need to be doing something on most days, and more formal exercise at least 3 times a week. And what's important about exercise, and I hear it all the time, and I just heard it on the patient that I just saw this morning, who had a BMI of 48 and came, and rheumatoid arthritis and a number of other things going on. And part of what we talked about was exercise and diet. But what I often talk about is a couple of things. One is that, first of all, strength training is critical. And so I like to get this message out there, that if our patients or we are walking, that's good. Any physical activity is better than none. But the reality is, they did some studies, this was the early 90s, actually I think published New England Journal 93, study out of Hebrew Rehab, where they, up until that point, they weren't sure if maybe as part of the aging process, you could no longer build strength or muscle mass. And so this was one of these, some of you may be familiar with these fix-it studies. It was studies in frail elderly. And this one looked at, basically asked the question, could you build strength and muscle mass at any age? And the oldest person in the study was 103. And they actually used machines and, you know, with a trainer. And they actually not only did strength testing, but they actually had CAT scans of the muscles to show that there was actually growth of muscle mass. And they had a nutrition group and then a control group. And what they basically showed was that, yes, you could build strength even at 103. And what was interesting was that later in life, nutrition was not enough and the aerobic conditioning was not enough. You really needed strength training to maintain your quality of life, because as we all know, later in life, it's activities of daily living, right? I mean, it's not, can I walk 3 miles? It's, can I get out of a chair? Can I bathe myself? Can I dress myself? And so it's this, pardon me, it's the strength training that you do today, or our patients do today, that's going to, in many ways, help determine the quality of life that they will have later in life. So very, very important. I know for me, and what I say to my patients is, you schedule it like you do lunch. You know, meaning most of my mornings start with exercise. Sometimes I only get, like most of my middays, I tend to try to have lunch. Occasionally I will miss lunch. Sometimes lunch is only 20 minutes, right, or kind of on the fly, just like sometimes exercise. And sometimes I have a little more time. So, but if I miss it too often, I don't feel good, right? And so, you know, it's literally in my schedule around midday, right, as I'm sure it is for many of you. Consistency and intensity are more critical than time. So, you know, when I only have 20 minutes like I did today, I'm not doing an exercise and talking to someone for 5 minutes, right? I was kind of going from set to set and doing my thing. And you want to keep it interesting, and sometimes an exercise buddy can be helpful. I always like to say, I think you heard, I oversee the fitness center, you know, PepsiCo. And so a lot of the people when I go there, I go in the mornings, obviously, and most people in the morning know that I have some responsibilities over that. But when I'm exercising, my headphones are in, and I am not giving off the energy that I am open to conversation, right? I mean, that is my time, and I take that time for me. Now afterwards, when I'm in the locker room, if you want to tell me that, like, the shower head is broken in stall number 3, I'll happy to try to do something about that. But, you know, I really try to protect that time when I don't have my cell phone on me, I'm not answering calls or what have you. And you know what, quite frankly, we all deserve that, don't we? I mean, we make all this time for everyone else in our lives because we love them. And as I often like to say to my patients, well, can't we love ourselves as much as we love our patients? I mean, I think, don't we deserve that? And so, you know, I don't have time because it's for my kids, my husband, my wife, whatever. You know, that just doesn't fly. And the other thing I like to say is that nature really doesn't care, right? It just kind of catches up with us after time. So, stress. So, you know, there's a lot of epidemics in this country that we could talk about. Stress is certainly one of them. It's amazing. This data, you know, 22% of Americans reported extreme stress. Most felt, or almost most, 44 that had stress had increased over the last 5 years. When you look at many of the symptoms that can be stress-related, they are often actually the most common reasons that people present to their primary care physician. So things like headaches or upset stomach, again, not necessarily being caused by stress, but often can be caused or exacerbated by stress. I have a particular interest in this, and one of the sort of concepts I think that's particularly important is that stress is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, there's much stress we would want in our lives, you know, applying for that new job or getting, you know, for the promotion, or I don't know, maybe giving grand rounds at Duke, you know, for the nursing school. You know, one could say, well, that's a little stressful. But I could avoid the stress. I could have said no. But of course, I don't want to do that. I love giving grand rounds and I love giving these talks. But of course, you know, those things, that can be a stress component to it. So running away from those events isn't necessarily the answer. Not that there aren't things in our lives that we can and should do without, but it's more about the way we think about those events, right? So if I start thinking, gosh, what if I screw this talk up? What if people don't like me or whatever? I'm going to lose a lot of sleep. And if I can do, so what happens there is, let me step back for a minute. So we have an issue. Well, let's use Duke Grand Rounds, whatever. I wasn't going to do that, but I will. So let's say I have to give a big talk today. And let's just say that led to a reaction of feeling anxious or fearful. It didn't, but let's say that it did. I felt pretty good coming here today. Let's say that it did. We often go right from this issue right to the reaction. And we recognize the reaction. We all, you know, we're pretty good at recognizing, gosh, I'm feeling anxious right now. What we aren't often good at recognizing, okay, is that in between, okay, we go like this, in between is a belief or a thought, right, about that particular event. Again, you know, what if I embarrass myself? What if I say something? Oh, who knows, right? Whatever the things we are that go on in our head, right? And it's actually possible, if you're mindful, to be able to stop in the moment and challenge that thought or that belief. And to the degree that that belief lacks validity, well, wait a minute. You give talks all the time. You know this subject matter very well. You know, the nurses are friendly and they're nice. You know, you're married to a nurse. It's okay. You'll be all right. You know, you can then hopefully kind of say, well, why am I feeling this way then? So just sort of a concept. I think what we're talking about here is, you know, this idea of the mind-body connection, right, which in some ways can cause a lot of distress and problems, not only for us, but for our patients, right? I mean, that are feeling pain or feeling anxiety, and that's causing release of inflammatory chemicals, you know, what have you, and as well as sort of emotional distress and what have you. So there's that negative, but it's possible to use it the other way and recognize that that connection is so strong that, you know, if we can calm the mind, we can probably calm those reactions or even lessen the pain they may be experiencing. You know, we've done a lot to study this now, right? Psychoneuroimmunology, and we're understanding more and more about sort of the power of sort of the mind-body connection. And we know that when we don't do a good job, right, whether it's us or our patients, and we stress out, we worry, we ruminate, we do all these things that, you know, are really quite common, both through biological pathways, autonomic nervous system, endocrine metabolic, you have it, as well as behavioral pathways like eating too much or the wrong foods or smoking or what have you, we increase our risk of illness and disease. And that increased risk is quite significant. You know, one of the ways that we have begun to talk a lot about, we're talking a lot about here at Duke in different ways, even with the nursing school and the nursing departments. Certainly, as we've looked at some of our employee burnout data and work-life balance issues that are coming up, you know, resiliency is one of the ways, enhancing resiliency is one of the ways that that's being looked at. And again, if you think back to what I was saying about Mike and this broader view of what we can do in healthcare, you know, there are some things that are more medically related perhaps, but a lot of this is really, it's like everything else, right? There's some health, like, yeah, well, I mean, we could give you a pill to help you sleep better, right? But most of this requires a different approach to help people to really feel like they're thriving in life. That approach often really rests upon our ability to care for ourselves. And in research in healthcare, this is often referred to as self-regulation. it's basically an innate capacity we all have to sort of care for ourselves. And examples are doing things like eating right or exercising and making sure to get enough sleep or meditating. And they've done some interesting studies, because sometimes some of this stuff may feel a little touchy-feely, right? And hopefully not for this audience, but certainly for other audiences, sometimes it does. And so I often like to show, some of the data, and when some of these things like putting people into a group where they actually have relaxation training and expression of thoughts and feelings, what the impact can be. In this case, this was metastatic cancer patients. And what they actually did was they had some observers ranking the individuals involved in the study really on how engaged they were in the whole program. Like some were just kind of maybe going through the paces versus the ones that were really making it a top priority. And then based on that, they looked at survival. And what they found is it was a survival benefit regardless, but that the clear survival benefit and the highest survival benefit came from those individuals who were most involved in their self-care. And many of us maybe have seen this over the years. We might have attributed to sort of having a different kind of attitude, right? We see patients that tend to do well maybe versus ones that don't, and there seems to be something about their approach, their attitude, that seems to be having an impact. And again, I think this is a study that maybe even tries to get at that a little bit. That attitude is often one of, I'm going to beat this, I'm going to do what I can. It's also, I think, related to a sense of control and what an individual can do to gain control over a situation, particularly something like cancer, where so often that sense of control is lost. How might these interventions make a difference? Well, we've begun to try to understand mechanistically, and I don't think we have an understanding yet, but I thought this was an interesting study, and this was done on healthy yoga instructors, but they basically showed that doing yoga actually upregulated natural killer cell activity. So again, not sort of a clear explanation as to why things like self-care with yoga and meditation and whatnot necessarily lead to a survival benefit in cancer patients, but these begin to generate additional hypotheses that we're trying to study so we can understand better how all this stuff really works, and by extension, how to most effectively integrate it with the other things that we do to care for patients that have cancer or any other disease or condition. So a concept I've alluded to is this idea of mindfulness. And Duke Integrative Medicine, I've been there 5 years. Well before the building was built, the Integrative Medicine program, and people like Larry in the audience, hope I'm saying this correctly, really came out of initially an interest in mindfulness to a great degree with people like Larry and Jeff Brantley and others. And it's a really interesting and important concept. Again, one that's really kind of gaining traction, both within healthcare and within the industry, so large self-insured entities. You hear a lot about the Comcast or the HPs or having these mindfulness programs for their employees to help with their employees to be more productive and happier in the workplace and whatnot. This is the way John Kabat-Zinn talks about what mindfulness actually is, and it's, and again, I think something to understand is that it's an innate human capacity and something that can be cultivated, but it's really, in some ways, it's the ability to be aware and present. And maybe we feel like, oh, we do that, but how many times have some of you maybe looked at a cell phone during this talk or thought about whatever, what are you having for dinner tonight, or whatever the case may be, or even when we're with that patient, how easy it is to get distracted, whenever that may be. And there's so many distractions nowadays, right? Text messaging all the time, it's amazing. So, I have 5 children, and their ages almost 24 to 14, and it's, it's just constant, right? I mean, they text more than they talk, which is a little scary. So, maybe they're present there, but they're missing so much, right? I mean, it's just kind of a strange dynamic at the time. So, the message isn't that, as you heard me joke with Larry earlier, I don't meditate. I mean, I've meditated quite a bit off and on, and the point is, though, I'm probably more like this guy over here, dinner, but I like, for me, my exercise, a little bit of moving meditation, and the key point being that we all need tools on our tool belt, whatever it is for you, whatever it is for our patients, that help them to be more mindful, to manage stress, what have you. And again, thinking about it from the perspective of the positive psychologist, right, who realize that, you know, mental well-being isn't just about removing the negative, right? It's not like, oh, I'm no longer depressed or I'm no longer anxious, you know, getting back to some baseline that's suboptimal. But what do we need to do to make sure that we're happy, that we're feeling gratitude, that we're feeling fulfilled, all the positives, so we're feeling loved, all the positive emotions, right? So what do we need to do to get there? I'm not claiming meditation is necessarily the cure, but that we all need our routine. We need the things that we do day in, day out that sort of keep us in that positive place. When we don't have that tools, we see things like people don't sleep well. And again, I don't know about you, but I'm starting to feel like poor sleep is like the next big epidemic in this country. I mean, I can't meet someone that tells me they sleep well. It's really hard. I think a lot of people are having trouble with sleep these days. And of course, when you don't sleep well, it messes up a lot of stuff. I mean, it really causes problems with the immune system, upregulation of inflammation through C-reactive protein, IL-6, messes with our stress hormones, moods, leads to weight gain, all kinds of things. Now, of course, one might think, well, in integrative medicine, why don't we just take some melatonin, right? Instead of taking the Ambien, let's take melatonin. And, you know, there may be a role for melatonin. It certainly has some interesting mechanisms of action. It's in the body naturally, obviously made by the body, but taking it externally, probably the best data is for jet lag, but may help people to get to sleep sooner and may prolong sleep to some degree. But for me, I found it interesting that there was similar impacts on melatonin if you did transcendental meditation or yoga, right? So imagine I could take the pill, right? Or I could take the yoga class and get all the positive benefits from a fitness perspective and everything else, and maybe it's going to help me sleep better at night as well. So, you know, I tend to try to think more that way in terms of how am I living a life that's kind of getting me where I want to go. And if it's an occasional night where the yoga didn't quite do it and the sleepy time tea, then, you know, maybe there's a role for a natural product. But it's got to supplement, right? These dietary supplements need to supplement an overall healthy lifestyle, right? Not replace it. Finally, try to leave a few minutes for questions at the end. Let me move through a little bit on, or not finally because I have complimentary, but almost finally, nutrition. And I could talk a lot about this. This is one of my favorite subjects. So I do a lot of changing diets with people. I'm very interested, for example, in research like the research that looked at Happy Meals, or the equivalent of a Happy Meal, and basically showed that a Happy Meal upregulates NF-kappa B, one of our main inflammatory pathways, for 3 hours. So, you know, I've been talking about these different epidemics in the country. Is it stress, sleep, diabetes, obesity, whatever? At a very core level,